Allow me at the outset to welcome you to the Trudeau Center for a new lecture on Iranian antiquity. And I would like to say that it's an immense pleasure to introduce today's speaker, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Robert Rollinger, Professor of Ancient History and Ancient Near East Studies at the University of Innsbruck in Austria, and presently a Getty Scholar at the Villa. I would also like to seize this opportunity to thank our colleagues, especially Alexa Segura, Jeffrey Spears and Tim Potts for graciously facilitating these academic exchanges between the Getty and the Trudeau Center at UCLA for the second year as part of the Getty's successful series, The Classical World in Context, which this year, like the last, concentrates on the exchanges between the classical world and ancient Persia. Professor Rollinger belongs to that rare breed of historians of antiquity, the kinds of whom we used to find in the German-speaking academe at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, for whom the world of antiquity constituted a connected expanse which, notwithstanding the linguistic and cultural particularities, the historian of the ancient world had fully to grasp and maintain as a backdrop in order to illuminate even the most minute phenomenon within its confines. Thus, for him, the Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern world are so profoundly intertwined that we have to move beyond more rudimentary notions of exchanges and connections and strive to understand this geography as one calling for a more holistic treatment. Needless to say, to foster such ambitions today, at a time of extreme specializations, may be anathema to many and be deemed a sheer impossibility to all. However, Professor Rollinger's extraordinary publications and activities are a testimony that such a view has a legitimate place in the academia and such pursuits are worthy of emulation. His work is too multifaceted for me to attempt an introduction at this juncture. Suffice it to say, his writings, beginning with his by now classical monograph on Herodotus' narrative on Babylonia, namely Herodotus' Babylonische Logos, and I shall spare you the rest of the title, it's quite a complicated one, is a must for all students of ancient history and exquisitely illustrates not only his ability to command over different literary traditions, both cuneiform and classical, critically to assess or innovatively to synthesize them, but more importantly, shows his grand and wide perspective on what constitutes ancient history and historiography in the tradition we just described. Numerous are his monographs and articles on ancient Greece and the ancient Near East, on forms of historical thinking, ideology, and propaganda, and ancient Persia. As impressive as his writings are, his editorial work is even more breathtaking. By dint of the quality and prevalence, some 60 volumes, 57 by my last count, they have re-established the holistic study of the ancient world as a discipline. The proceedings of the millennium conferences, or his editorship at the helm of the Classica et Orientalia, are just a few nuggets testifying his prodigious activity and creativity. Allow me to add, I deem him, next to our dear colleague, Professor Josef Wieserhofer, as the most consequential and internationally recognized Althistoriker of our days. In today's lecture, Contextualizing the Achaemenid-Persian Empire, we shall see him practicing what I have been professing all along about him. Professor Rollinger will be challenging our traditional view of a linear succession of empires in the ancient Orient in the first millennium before the Common Era, by reconceptualizing the notion of empire and redefining the role of the periphery in the interconnected world of antiquity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rollinger.
So thank you so much, Raim, for these nice words. Were much too much. Thank you for this very kind invitation. It's a pleasure for me being here. I also want to thank the Getty for the opportunity to stay in Los Angeles for half a year. So how I am going to proceed, I will structure my talk, which will take about 45-50 minutes, in 4 chapters. As you can see it here, a short introduction. Then I will move into the topic. Second chapter, general aspects of longue durée developments, conquest and growth of empire. Then the third chapter on peripheries and border zones. And a fourth and last one on dynasty and succession. So let's start with the first chapter, the introduction. In the last years, it has become increasingly obvious that major developments in the history of the Achaemenid-Persian Empire can only be adequately understood when they are seen in larger historical contexts. It has been realized that the Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian empires share a common stream of tradition that cannot be ignored, which affects culture, kingship, ideology, worldview, and bureaucracy. This also applies for general political developments that concern conquest, dynasty, self-perception, and the fundamental question of the stability or weakness of these 3 empires. Thus, for a better understanding of the Persian Empire, it is necessary to develop a broader perspective and locate it within the context of a succession of ancient Eastern empires, a context that starts with the evolution of the Neo-Assyrian Empire some centuries before. Second chapter, general aspects of longue durée developments. Where conquest and growth are concerned, the Persian Empire can be described as a direct successor of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Since the time of Ashur-Natsir-Pal II and his son Shalmaneser III in the 9th century BCE, the Neo-Assyrian state developed as an empire. The backbone of this progression was a powerful and increasingly multi-ethnic army that was successfully professionalized. With this powerful instrument, the Neo-Assyrian kings started to conquer all the core areas of the ancient Near East, beginning with northern Mesopotamia, parts of southern Anatolia, and northwestern Iran. Under Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century, the regions to the west of the Euphrates were organized as provinces and permanently integrated into the empire. Babylonia was ruled in personal union, and southern Anatolia and western Iran became part of the empire. Sargon II, end of the 8th century BC, and his son Sennacherib consolidated these achievements. The last independent city-states on the upper Euphrates in southern Anatolia were eliminated, Cilicia became a province, and the city-states of Cyprus were controlled as vassals. Assyrian influence reached as far as Tabal, nowadays Cappadocia, parts of the central Zagros area were provincialized, and Urartu, a cumbersome political competitor, was beaten and reined in. Only Babylonia continued to create problems which were not solved until the reigns of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. So we are already in the 7th century BC, when Assyria reached its apogee. Control of Tyre meant that the Assyrian perspective now included the whole Mediterranean as far as the Straits of Gibraltar. The delta of the Nile and Upper Egypt were conquered. Arabian tribes in Syria and on the Arabian Peninsula acknowledged Assyrian suzerainty. So here you can see the maximal extension of this empire. An ensemble of tribes that the Assyrian called Madaya, that is our Medes, were also controlled by the empire, whose influence in the east probably reached as far as the region of modern Tehran. Another political competitor, Elam, in southwestern Iran, was beaten decisively and diplomatic ties were established with the emerging power of Lydia in western Anatolia. The Assyrian Empire ruled the world, and this claim was verbalized and disseminated by the inscriptions of the Neo-Assyrian kings. So far, the history of the empire was a history of ongoing conquests and imperial growth, and contemporaries may have thought that this empire would never come to an end and soon subdue all the remaining independent states in the Middle East. Yet, this was a fallacy, or at least partly an erroneous belief. It was a fallacy because within 20 years after the death of Ashurbanipal, the empire crumbled and disappeared from the political landscape. But at the same time, it was only partly an erroneous belief because the Assyrian heritage remained intact, because the structure and idea of an empire established by the Assyrians survived and kept its dynamics for the next 300 years at least. From a higher and overarching perspective that focuses on the expansionist structure of empire, and that's a very important aspect, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was succeeded by a period of about 2/3 of a century when no new dynasty could be established. The ruling monarchs were eager to maintain the imperial idea, but this idea was expressed in an entirely new form. Although the empire was re-established after the conquests of Nebuchadnezzar II, this did not happen on the same scale as before, and the empire's ongoing expansionist dynamic clearly faded. It is true that Neriglissar and Nabonidus waged wars in the west and that the latter was heavily engaged in the Arabic Peninsula. But the general outline of their politics was much more focused on preserving what had already been achieved than on opening up new areas of conquest. So the brown colored area is the one of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This defensive element, as I would call it, in imperial policy was a distinctive characteristic of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And it comes as no surprise that in its royal inscriptions, military affairs only play a minor role. Apart from some areas on the northwestern Arabian Peninsula, you can see it on the map, which were controlled by Nabonidus, not a single region was subdued that had not already been under the sway of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Preserving what had already been part of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was the motto, not subduing regions and areas which lay beyond its boundaries. This period of imperial stagnation radically changed with the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. With the Tespit Cyrus, a new imperial power entered the stage of the ancient Near East and, after about 70 years of expansionist standstill, re-established a military vigor that had not only weighed with that of the Neo-Assyrians, but eventually outperformed it and gave the idea of world empire entirely new dimensions. Because of a lack of sources, we are not very well informed about each single step of the various conquests of Cyrus and his son Cambyses. But these were major events that went far beyond the imperial achievement of their Neo-Assyrian predecessors. Already some time before the conquest of Babylonia, Cyrus had established a potent power base in Anshan, that is in modern Fars, from where he started to expand towards the north. We do not know exactly when he took control of the region of ancient Susiani, that is modern Khuzestan, but he certainly took a major step towards empire building when he subdued the mighty confederation of the Medes that ruled the central Zagros. This event can be dated to 550 BC, and from that time onwards, Cyrus controlled most of the resources of western and probably already central Iran. In 547 BC, Cyrus subjugated eastern Anatolia, where some successor states of the former Urartian Empire had stood the test of time. Sometime in the 540s, he celebrated a further major victory when he subjected the leading kingdom in western Anatolia. If we believe the account of the Greek historian Herodotus, other parts of western Anatolia were subdued by Cyrus' generals. This fits well with what we know from the Neo-Assyrian Empire, where it was, besides the king, mighty magnates who were responsible for waging war. In any case, from this time onwards, also Greek city-states in western Anatolia became part of the new empire being established by the Thespids. Thus, when Cyrus conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire, he was no longer a nobody, acting out of nowhere, but already ruled a strong and powerful state. This new empire included Mesopotamia and Syria as well and reached as far as the borders of Egypt. But this was by no means the end of the expansionist story. We do not know exactly when Cyrus subjugated eastern Iran and vast regions of modern Central Asia as far as the river Yaxartes, so that is nowadays Syrdarya. According to Greek sources, it was towards the end of his reign, but this should not be taken uncritically as historical fact. The conquest of vast areas of central and eastern Iran could very well have been achieved step by step, and Cyrus' son Cambyses may also have been involved in this major undertaking. In general, Greek sources have a very positive view on Cyrus. He is hardly ever described as aggressive, but much more as a heroic figure who only reacts when he is attacked or in danger. This only changes when Cyrus started to campaign in Central Asia. Again, this campaign is only mentioned by classical sources. One of them, Herodotus, claims that Cyrus was killed in action while fighting against Central Asian nomads, whom the classical sources dub Scythians or Massagetae. Whether this is true or not cannot be verified, but the fact that some years later Darius I considered his victory over the Scythian leader Skuncha of such an importance that he ordered a complete reshaping of the Pisotun monument in order to add a relief image of his opponent suggests that it was seen and celebrated as the defeat of an enemy who had even been able to resist Cyrus the Great. In any case, with Cyrus, a new conqueror king entered the scene after the Neo-Assyrian kings. The astonishment and admiration aroused by these achievements are echoed not only by classical sources, but also by the small Jewish community in Palestine and Babylonia, in whose eyes Cyrus represented the new Messiah. Yet, this new phase of expansion did not come to an end with Cyrus himself. Since the time of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, Egypt had been considered to be part of the new ancient Near Eastern imperial system. Where Nebuchadnezzar II had failed, Cambyses achieved a major success. In a single campaign, he subdued the land of the river Nile. As once again only classical sources testify, Cambyses probably also tried to get control of Cyrenaica and Nubia. Whether he failed and it was left to Darius to include these countries in his empire is difficult to say. In any case, in the lists of lands which first appear in Achaemenid royal inscriptions in the reign of Darius, Nubia, Ethiopia, which is called Kusha, and the people to the west of Egypt, the so-called Butaya, were claimed to be part of the empire. The same is true for Cyprus, which was under control of the Persians from Darius I onwards at the latest. Although the change from the Thespids to the Achaemenids was accompanied by a disastrous war that afflicted the whole empire, expansion did not come to an end with the establishment of a new dynasty by Darius I. So there you can see the empire in its largest extension. With the first two kings, Darius and his son Xerxes, the expansionist agenda continued. As already mentioned, Darius partly subjected the nomads of Central Asia, and he enlarged the empire in the east as far as India, western regions of which, that is modern Pakistan, became part of the empire. The Scythian campaign to the north of the Black Sea, on which classical sources report, might never have taken place, but Thrace became a part of the empire and Macedonia a vassal state. For the first time in the history of ancient Near Eastern empires, the expansionist agenda was not only pursued via land forces. With the help of the city-states of the Syrian coast, an imperial fleet was created, probably already under Cambyses, when he campaigned against Egypt and took control of Cyprus. This navy became even more important when Darius began to operate in the Aegean. With these endeavors, however, the empire appears to have suffered from imperial overstretch, and it had to renounce direct control of the Greek world. Xerxes did at first try to follow the policy of his father and his Thespiid predecessors, but in the end he established a new political doctrine and the empire entered a new stage in history. As in Neo-Babylonian times, expansion was given up and the preservation of what had been achieved started to be the primary goal. Once again, this new development was accompanied by the development of new ideological positions in the royal inscriptions. Not only did waging war suddenly disappear from these texts, but history was regarded as having come to an end, since the Achaemenids claimed to rule the whole world. According to this ideology, there was no power left that needed to be subdued. It is no surprise that this form of ideology was an integral part of the agenda of imperial preservation. And the empire was still very effective in this respect. Although the Aegean and Egypt were lost for some time, Persian influence could be successfully re-established after some decades. In the first case, indirectly, with the King's Peace in 387, in the second, directly with the conquest of Egypt by Artaxerxes III in 343. When viewing ancient Near Eastern history from this overarching perspective, the phase of preservation, as opposed to conquest, did not come to an end with the Achaemenids. It continued actually with Alexander the Great, who conquered huge parts of the Persian Empire, but was not able to add a single piece of land that had not already been under Achaemenid control. And the same holds true for about the first 100 years after Alexander's death, when first Perdiccas and Antigonos Monophthalmos, and then the early Seleucids, tried to secure what had been achieved by their Achaemenid predecessors. Only when the Seleucids failed with Antiochus III and IV did the history of the ancient Near Eastern empires, as it had been established by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, finally come to an end. This history had lasted for about 700 years, and the Thespiid Achaemenid Empire had been an integral part of it. Times of conquest had been followed by times of stagnation, which in turn gave way to periods when the expansionist agenda was re-established. In the end, after the downfall of the Achaemenid Empire, people once again faced about 100 years of stagnation of imperial growth. In this long period, imperial traditions were preserved to a considerable degree. Although dynasties changed and new imperial centers and regions emerged, the core areas of each imperial predecessor remained under the sway of the new empire. For this reason, it is not by chance that the last preserved royal inscription in cuneiform originates from the time of the Seleucid king Antiochus I, so in the beginning of the 3rd century BC. Tradition still loomed large, but when the Seleucid Empire started to disintegrate, a new horizon of empire building emerged. There was no political power left that was capable of taking over the previous empire as a whole, even simply to preserve it, let alone as a basis for a new expansionist agenda. The Achaemenid Empire remained the climax within this long-term development. Instead, with the Roman and Parthian empires, two new superpowers emerged on the fringes of this huge and ancient imperial structure. Neither of these two, however, was able to reconquer the whole. In the end, it was divided between them, and a new era of two opposing empires started. This is another story. Although, in the succeeding centuries, both opponents again and again tried to breach the newly established border at the river Euphrates. But neither the Roman Emperor Trajan and Justinian, nor the Sasanian Shahs Khusrau I and Khusrau II were able to preserve their impressive short-term conquests for more than some years. So let's move to the third chapter, peripheries and border zones. As we have seen, new powers emerged on the fringes of established empires, and after a period of coexistence, were prepared to challenge the older empire successfully. This phenomenon deserves attention and further explanation, since it is a characteristic of the long-term historical development of the ancient Near East and has considerable relevance for the Achaemenid Empire. Historians have long been aware that, both in antiquity and later, dynamic processes of socio-political transformations took place on the fringes of empires and result in a sustained transformation of the societies in contact with those empires. These processes are multi-layered and intricate. On the one hand, they can partly be described by the non-unproblematic term secondary state formation, that is, triggering a development towards political, social, and economic complexities that transform comparatively simply structured societies in much more stratified and sophisticated ones. However, it is far more than that. It also affects, on the other hand, already highly developed, socially complex, and traditionally established societies that are, however, politically fragmented and in a permanent state of internal and regional competition. Ongoing contact with empire and imperial politics, direct and/or indirect, prompts and stimulates processes towards the establishment of larger political units and structures that, at the end, might even be prepared to challenge the empire herself. Unfortunately, our written sources are frequently entirely ignorant about these revolutionary developments. They only become visible after the event, when political and military conflicts arise and we suddenly observe the results of what has been a long-term process. The encounters between, on the one hand, empires with comparatively highly developed bureaucracies and forms of political and administrative praxis, and on the other hand, societies where political authority was either less developed, often involving highly fragmented entities and an illiterate local culture, or less far-reaching, already established city-states and territorial states, considerably changed the worlds of the latter. Both center and periphery became part of an imperial matrix that was defined by asymmetric relations. The newly established ties between these different worlds took various forms. On the one hand, trade and economic ties played a major role in the transformation of local systems and the introduction of new forms of exchange and economic mentalities. Smaller regions with their local economies and local production and exchange networks now became part of an imperial world system that only triggered new kinds of specialization, but also opened up new markets and modes of exchange. These new conditions converted processes of production as well as the products themselves. Advances of this sort not only transformed local infrastructure and modes of production, but also had a big impact on the local elites who were in charge of these processes. These elites had previously focused on local networks, but suddenly entirely new possibilities of income and generating revenues emerged. These developments took place on the peripheries of empires, although these peripheries were not themselves a homogeneous world, but were highly diversified. Increasingly, they became crossroads of interaction, where local leaders, looking to their own interests, took advantage of the new basic conditions by monitoring and controlling trans-regional networks that were to a varying degree with different nuances part of overarching imperial structures. How far these networks actually reached is difficult to say, but it has been demonstrated in the last decades that the networks triggered by the dynamics of the Neo-Assyrian Empire reached in the west as far as the Straits of Gibraltar and in the east as far as Central Asia and India. On the other hand, the peripheries were open to various forms of socio-political influence from the adjacent empire. As already mentioned, the new streams of goods and commodities had to be organized and channeled. This in itself fostered political centralization and boosted the development of new political structures with trans-regional perspectives. But again and again, the empire also demonstrated its presence on the periphery by political and military intervention. The trajectory of such interventions was provided by the empire's thirst for expansion and the permanent and dynamic process of establishing new zones of direct and indirect rule. Empires do not have strictly fixed borders in the manner of modern national states, but develop border zones that are characterized by different modes of influence. Especially from the second half of the 8th century BC onwards, there was a trend towards provincialization, conquered areas, and establishing direct rule via imperial bureaucracies. But there were also various vassal states where, on the surface, political control remained in the hand of local dynasties, but which actually became part of the empire. And there was a zone beyond these structures, where there was still some indirect influence, be it through the vassal states and their rulers, or through diplomatic and economic ties. This ongoing process of political integration, which was also triggered by different modes of contributions, taxes, tributes, and gift, substantially transformed the political structures of the peripheries. Ways of ruling, political practice, imperial bureaucracy and administration, political ideology, political expression of power, and the economic basics for the new developments became common knowledge, were eagerly adapted and adopted, and created an entirely new type of local leader who copied and imitated imperial behavior, but also became more and more aware of the possibilities of his own political agendas. Since these local leaders and their subjects generally contributed troops to the empire's army, they came in contact with the latter's superior military technology, and that was also taken up and readily acquired. Finally, there was the sophisticated high culture of the empire with its cities, temples, huge buildings, and material wealth, which not only established a measuring stick for local developments and orientations, but also generated a conception of pomp and circumstance that became an ongoing object of desire. This object could be sought by imitation and cultural transfer, but it could also provoke an appetite for appropriation, conquest, and plunder. With this, a change in local mentalities went hand in hand. The empire was looked upon with fear and respect, admiration and hate. One was part of the system, but at the same time able to develop new identities. The periphery had to find its place in a new world that was accomplished by integration and alienation at the very same time. The new modes of thinking, exercising political power and generating economic wealth were only possible because one was part of an imperial world system. Simultaneously, however, there was an overriding desire to ignore these bonds and to pursue one's own political ambitions in line with the newly developed ethnic and socio-political identities. Complex developments of this sort were not an invention of the first millennium BC, but the establishment of the ancient Near Eastern empires provided an unprecedented stimulus for them to occur. There are examples to be referred at, for example, the establishment of Phrygia in the 8th century BC, Lydia in the 7th century, the Neo-Elamite state in the 7th century BC, and so on. At about the same time, another process of major political change took place in an area that had originally been controlled by the Neo-Elamite Empire. Probably around 600 BCE, a new political power emerged in the modern Iranian province of Fars, which clearly exhibited an Elamite socio-political and cultural background, but at the same time involved political agents and elites with Iranian roots. The new political entity labeled itself Anshan and very soon developed a desire for expansion as its median neighbor to the north had already done. Sometime in the first half of the 6th century BC, Susiani, modern Khuzestan, became part of this state, and in 550 BC, the Median Confederation was subdued by Cyrus the Great, who presented himself as king of Anshan. Cyrus' success is reported not only in the Babylonian Chronicle, but also in an inscription of the Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus. This is important in its own right, generally speaking. Ancient Near Eastern royal inscriptions refer to foreign regions only when they are subdued by or come under the direct or indirect control of Mesopotamian rulers. But times had already changed, and the dynamic processes of socio-political change that occurred on the periphery of the Mesopotamian empires could no longer be ignored. These processes are not only important as political facts, but are also significant for the history of the Mesopotamian empires. The formation of new states and new elites in the peripheries had repercussions for the empires themselves. As already mentioned, elites of this sort arose in contexts that were fundamentally shaped by imperial models, yet at the same time they devised political agendas and concepts of their own. The result was not only the destruction of the old empires by forces originating from these peripheries, but also a takeover of the old empires by the new elites of these regions. Thus, discontinuities and continuities were present at the very same time. The idea of empire, its general structure and representation, survived, but the new elites set it against new backgrounds. This is true not only for the Median conglomerate and the Neo-Babylonian Empire, but also for the state of Anshan, which in a very short time developed into the strongest political power in the ancient Near East. It has already been stressed that we only know a tiny amount about the different stages of its military expansion to the east. But however, much the emergence and structure of this state owed to its close contacts to the Elamite and Babylonian cultures. Its astoundingly rapid expansion to the east can only have been possible because of pre-existing and probably trans-regional political structures. Just as the Median conglomerate, a result of dramatic socio-political transformations on the fringes of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, finally overran that empire, so the state of Anshan, a product of similar transformation processes within and on the peripheries of Elam and Babylonia, not only eliminated Elam, but eventually subdued the Neo-Babylonian Empire as well in 539. Once again, then, it was from the periphery that a new empire emerged, and this empire was not only powerful enough to take over the old one, but was capable of shaping a new one of unprecedented dimensions. During the reigns of Darius and Xerxes, this empire was the largest one the world had ever seen. But of course, it did not cover the entire world, and the principles of socio-political change of previous times also applied on its fringes. In the east, it was again Iranian tribes that were mostly affected by these developments. In the west, it was the territorial states of Macedonia and Thrace, and then, half a century later, the Athenian Empire and Sparta. Although it is not a common approach in Western scholarship, the confrontation of the Persian Empire with Athens, Sparta, and Macedonia can be explained and described as the result of evolving processes of socio-political transformations on the periphery of an empire. The only difference is that this time our sources mainly originate from the periphery and have specific perspectives on the events in question. These subjective and ideologically motivated perspectives have been generalized and become part of the Western tradition. But if we try to leave Hellenocentrism and Eurocentrism aside, we immediately recognize that we are dealing with general political trends and long-term trajectories that are less dependent upon a particular nation or race than on underlying structures. And as Cyrus emerged on the fringes of a world empire, which he eventually conquered, the same applies to Alexander and his conquest of the Achaemenid Empire. A new power arose on the periphery of an empire that was eventually captured and subdued by that peripheral power. But this proved to be the last successful conquest of an entire empire in the ancient Near Eastern history. With Parthia in the east and Rome in the west, new empires did again show up on the peripheries, but neither was now capable of regaining what the Achaemenids had established. They faced each other on the Euphrates and had to share the Achaemenid heritage. So now the last chapter, dynasty and succession. In this discussion of various continuities and discontinuities between the Neo-Assyrian and the Persian Achaemenid empires, one point remains to be dealt with, namely the problem of dynasty and succession. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is one of the empires, like those of the Sasanians and Ottomans, that was always ruled by a single family. But there are also empires in world history that display a totally different character in this regard, like, for example, the Roman Empire. This means that the existence or non-existence of a single dynasty does not in itself reveal much about the stability or instability of these political structures. It is more important to focus on how firmly anchored and accepted the concentration of political power in the hands of one family was, and how the state reacted to challenges to this power. The Persian Empire was ruled by two different dynasties, the Thespids and the Achaemenids. But a closer look at political developments immediately reveals that it is appropriate, at least when focusing on the establishment of political power, to conceptualize the formation of the Thespid state within the context of the history of its Neo-Babylonian predecessor. With the Achaemenids, by contrast, a new and much more successful idea of the state arose. Let us start once more with some remarks on the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So now it's time for this one, which just puts the things together. As already stressed, all Neo-Assyrian kings belonged to one single family. They formed a stable dynasty, and their right to rule appears to have been not only generally accepted, but also regarded as a fundamental feature of the empire. But this does not mean that the rule of Neo-Assyrian kings was not challenged. These challenges were various, and they should not automatically be equated with a crisis of the state. Usurpations took place fairly often, but as far as we can tell, it was nearly exclusively members of the royal family who challenged the reigning king or the crown prince's right to become the reigning king. Since ancient Near Eastern empires did not accept primogeniture, such revolts were not an extraordinary eventuality, and they could occur without major turbulences. The case was, however, different when the murder of the king led to longer civil wars and different factions fought for the throne. This happened when the usurper did not gain immediate acceptance by the elites. In these cases, when conflicts were not limited to the capital and the entire empire was affected for a longer period of time, we can recognize a crisis that might in principle endanger the very existence of the empires. And here you can see just some examples, but we do not have to go into detail for this. Legitimacy was dependent upon acceptance, and the people who had to do the accepting were the royal family and the elites of the empire. If there was homogeneity within this latter group, usurpation could not endanger the empire. But these elites had to be convinced, and this was achieved by legitimization strategies and ideological concepts that were announced in public via royal inscriptions, the contents of which were to be disseminated throughout the empire. Esarhaddon, 7th century BC, made some sort to avoid civil strife in the future. It is possible that he faced a revolt by a non-royal member of the imperial elite, a certain Sasi. So you have him on the map here. But this attempt at usurpation can only be reconstructed from indirect references in royal letters that hint at harsh measures against elite factions around 670 BC. In any case, in an unprecedented act, Esarhaddon sought to ensure the succession to the throne by administering an elaborate loyalty oath to the elites of the whole empire. Just imagine, the elites of the whole empire. That is, the members of the royal court and of the central administration, as well as each governor and his staff. As a result, Esarhaddon's younger son, Ashurbanipal, became king of Assyria, whereas the elder son, Shamash-shum-ukin, was installed as king of Babylon. At the beginning, after Esarhaddon had died, this arrangement appears to have worked fairly well, but at the end, another war was unavoidable. This confrontation can also be described as a civil war, and it took Ashurbanipal 4 years, 652 to 648, to subdue his brother. But since the Assyrian elites appear uniformly to have assisted Ashurbanipal, and since there was no serious external enemy at this time, the empire as such was not in danger. The situation dramatically changed with the death of Ashurbanipal around 630, so the date is not absolutely clear. The heir apparent, Ashur-etil-ilani, so it should be the next, okay, easier for you to follow. So the heir apparent, Ashur-etil-ilani, was a child, and the actual ruler was a powerful courtier, seen Shumulishir. But he appears not to have been able to gain the general acceptance of the imperial elites. This loss of community spirit among the imperial elites, together with serious external threats, sounded the bell for the last round of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. What followed was a combination of external and internal strife that lasted for about 20 years, and the dates and agents are put together again here without going into details. The rebellion of Nabopolassar of Babylon is reported in more detail in the Babylonian Chronicle and the king's own inscriptions. When the Medes showed up as allies of the Babylonians, the resistance of the Assyrian Empire was finally broken, and its traditional capitals were devastated. Ashur in 614, Nineveh in 612. Egyptian intervention allowed the Assyrians to create a temporary refuge around Haran, but when this city was captured in 609, the last Neo-Assyrian ruler, Ashur-uballit, disappeared. With the successful campaigns of Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar II, a new empire with new elites and new center arose. The Egyptians were expelled from Syria, and the whole of Mesopotamia was under his firm control. But the sort of stability that had been achieved by the Neo-Assyrian Empire in its heyday could not now be re-established. This is reflected in the fact that even militarily powerful and effective kings did not succeed in creating a new dynasty. I mean which lasts more than 3 generations. They tried to do so, but they failed. And the dynastic sequence always broke down at the latest in the 3rd generation with the appearance of a successful usurper. This unrest was due to tensions in the Babylonian elite that also became obvious when Nabonidus, the last Neo-Babylonian king, left Babylonia for about 10 years to hold court at Tema in the Arabian Peninsula. The fact that some of the usurpers of this period did not have royal ancestry and did not even claim to have one may hint at a certain loss of legitimacy and may have added to the political instability. Thus, Nebuchadnezzar II installed his underage son Amel-Marduk, but the latter was eliminated by Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law Neriglissar. The latter's son La-Abash-Marduk only ruled for some months when he again was removed by Nabonidus. When Bel-Sharu-Utsur, the crown prince, was introduced, but the military defeat against Cyrus once more prevented the establishment of a dynasty. Things did not immediately change with Cyrus. I think this is very important. Cyrus did appoint his son Cambyses as king of Babylon, and after some time as crown prince of the empire. And after Cyrus' death, Cambyses duly became king in 530. But when he died, the very short reign of a certain Bardia, who was probably Cambyses' own brother, gave way to a major civil war, and the Teispids were wiped out. After more than a year of harsh fighting that affected the whole empire, a new king, Darius, entered the scene in 522. Soon he too installed a crown prince, and this time a new Achaemenid dynasty was founded that ruled the empire until the death of Darius III in 330. Thus, it was only with the Achaemenids that a dynasty was successfully re-established in the manner familiar from Neo-Assyrian times. But the idea of dynastic succession was conceptualized in a new way, a fact that might also reflect an increased need for legitimization. In Neo-Assyrian times, dynastic affiliation was expressed in royal inscriptions by multi-part filiations, which might also mention a common ancestor, and when Esarhaddon claimed succession from all Assyrian kings from Adasi in the distant past onwards. The same approach is seen in king lists that referred to common and age-old ancestry. In the period between the Neo-Assyrians and the Achaemenids, this idea was both entirely given up and yet retained as an aspiration. Nabopolassar radically broke with the previous mode of legitimization and presented himself as son of a nobody. Neriglissar frankly referred to his non-royal ancestry by naming his father Bel-Shumu-Ishkun. And Nabonidus did not hide his non-royal background either. At the same time, in his inscriptions, Nebuchadnezzar again and again expressed his wish for the eternal reign of his progeny, Lipu, so in the future, of course. And this idea was adopted by Neriglissar, although in both cases it was, as we know, a pious hope. By contrast, in his famous cylinder inscription, Cyrus not only referred to his father and grandfather as kings, but also to a royal ancestor, Teispids, by name. This was an obvious return to Assyrian practices, although in the end not a successful one. Darius went one step further by combining old and new in an entirely novel manner. With 8 members, his line of antecedents was much longer than any previous one, but he only indirectly claimed that all of them had been kings. He also only adduced by name some members of his lineage, but when he did so in the case of his father or grandfather, they were presented without any royal title. There was, however, another ancestor who was attributed much more importance than any other previous figure. For Darius did not content himself with just referring to these Achaemenes, but for the first time in ancient Eastern history, a new term was derived from his name to label the entire lineage Achaemenid. Whereas the term Teispid is a modern invention, Achaemenid is an authentic neologism, coined to convey the idea of a common royal house in new terminology. It was a royal house that prospered for a very long time. Of course, there was also conspiracy and regicide during this period, but the dynasty was not in danger for almost 200 years. Kings were murdered. There are many examples for that, and there were rebellions in Egypt and Babylonia, as well as a short period of civil strife when Artaxerxes II was challenged by his younger brother Cyrus in 401. But opposition against the reigning king mainly arose from within the royal lineage itself. In the end, the newly established empire of Darius remained stable for 2 centuries. Thank you for your attention.